Bitterroot Valley, Montana. November 1891. The first snow had already claimed 2 homesteads that season. Families huddled around failing fireplaces, burning through cord after cord of pine, watching their breath crystallize in corners their fires couldn't reach. But in one cabin at the valley's eastern edge, something impossible was happening. Thomas Brennan, a rancher's 23-year-old son with no formal training, had built something the experienced builders called insane. They'd laughed at his design, called a waste of good stone, said he'd freeze before Christmas. They stopped laughing on January 9th, 1892. What did this young man understand about heat that 3 generations of Montana builders had missed? The answer would transform frontier construction across 4 territories and save countless lives in the brutal winters to come. Before we reveal his secret, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to learn could change how you think about heating forever. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and stay until the end to discover the exact measurements that made this impossible cabin 32 degrees warmer than every other structure in the valley. Thomas Brennan made his announcement on a Saturday in late October, standing in McCreary's general store with mud still on his boots. He just purchased 8 tons of river stone, twice what any cabin foundation required. Building a heat battery, he said simply when Samuel McCreary asked what the hell he needed all that sandstone for. The store went quiet. Then someone laughed. Thomas wasn't a builder. He was the youngest of 5 sons on a cattle ranch, the one who'd spent winters reading engineering journals his mother ordered from back east instead of learning practical trades. His father had died the previous spring, leaving Thomas a modest inheritance and a reputation as the family dreamer. And what now? McCreary's voice carried that particular tone, the one reserved for young men with more ambition than sense. A thermal mass system. I'm going to build the fireplace into the center of the cabin with a stone core that extends through both floors. The heat will store in the rock and radiate for hours after the fire dies. Jacob Wheeler, who'd built 17 cabins in the Bitterroot Valley, set down his coffee. Son, that's not how fireplaces work. You put them on an exterior wall so the smoke vents proper. Center placement? You'll fill the whole cabin with smoke, and all that stone will just pull heat away from the living space. Actually, Thomas pulled a folded diagram from his coat. If you angle the flue correctly and create a thermal envelope around the firebox with 14 inches of stone on all sides. 14 inches? Wheeler's face reddened. That's not a fireplace. That's a damn monument. You'll waste half your interior space and most of your heat up the chimney before that much stone even gets warm. But Thomas had done something the experienced builders hadn't. He'd read a translated paper about Russian masonry heaters and spent 3 months calculating heat retention rates for different stone densities. He'd measured the specific heat capacity of the sandstone from Sleeping Child Creek, 0.18 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. He'd sketched 17 different configurations before settling on this one. The problem was, none of that mattered to men who'd spent 30 Montana winters trusting what their hands had built. Listen to Wheeler, offered Martin Kohler, whose family had emigrated from Bavaria and built solid German-style cabins for 2 generations. Center fireplaces are for castles and manor houses with servants to tend them. A working man needs his fire on the wall where he can control it, where the heat goes straight into the room, not into a pile of rocks. Thomas folded his diagram. He'd expected this. His oldest brother had said the same thing, had refused to help with the construction, had called it college nonsense despite Thomas never having attended college. How much would you figure to burn each day? Wheeler asked, the challenge in his voice. Half a cord per week, maybe less. The laughter was louder this time. Wheeler burned nearly a cord and a half weekly, and his cabin was known as one of the warmer ones. Son, Wheeler said, almost kindly, you're going to learn an expensive lesson about the difference between books and survival. That stone will suck the heat right out of your fire. You'll be burning double just to keep from freezing, and when that January wind comes screaming down from Canada, you'll understand why we build the way we build. Thomas paid for his stone and arranged delivery. He had 8 weeks before the serious cold arrived. 8 weeks to prove that 3 generations of frontier wisdom had missed something fundamental about how heat actually works. Outside McCreary's store, The temperature was dropping, 42 degrees and falling. By morning, there'd be frost on the ground, and by December, there'd be mornings when the mercury wouldn't rise above zero. The question wasn't whether his design would work. Thomas had checked his calculations 17 times. The question was whether he'd survive being wrong. The foundation went down in the first week of November. Thomas excavated 4 feet deep, 2 feet deeper than standard, and laid a base of limestone fragments mixed with clay. Upon this, he built his thermal core. The design violated every convention Wheeler and the other builders followed, but it obeyed something more fundamental: the physics of heat storage and release. At the center of his 20 by 24-foot cabin, Thomas constructed what looked like a massive stone tower. The firebox itself was standard size, 36 inches wide, 24 inches deep, but it was surrounded by a shell of river sandstone that extended 18 inches in every direction. The total mass, approximately 4,200 pounds of stone. But mass alone wasn't the innovation. Any fool could pile rocks around fire. What Thomas understood, what he'd learned from those translated Russian papers and his own calculations, was that the geometry mattered as much as the mass. He built the firebox with a cross-sectional area deliberately smaller than conventional designs. Where Wheeler's fireplaces had openings of 12 to 14 square feet, Thomas's measured just 6. This concentrated the combustion, raising flame temperatures from the typical 800 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit to nearly 1,400 degrees. The hotter flame meant more complete combustion, less smoke, less creosote, more usable heat per pound of wood. But it also meant the surrounding stone reached temperatures conventional fireplace masonry never achieved. The flue system was equally unconventional. Instead of venting straight up, Thomas built a labyrinth of channels through the stone mass. Smoke and hot gases traveled upward through a primary flue, then were directed horizontally through secondary channels that ran in a spiral pattern through the sandstone core, before finally exiting through the roof. The path from firebox to sky measured 34 feet, nearly 3 times longer than a standard chimney. Every foot of that journey transferred heat into the stone. "You're building a smoke maze," his brother Daniel said when he visited the construction site. "It'll never draft properly. Smoke will back up into the cabin." Thomas had calculated the draft requirements precisely. The extended flue path created more resistance. Yes, but the higher combustion temperature generated more buoyancy. The system would draft. He'd verified the math using Bernoulli's principle and the ideal gas law. He'd even accounted for the Bitterroot Valley's elevation, 3,800 feet above sea level, where air density affected everything. By late November, the stone core stood 7 feet tall, wrapped in an outer wall of chinked logs. The firebox opening faced south. The secondary channels were complete, invisible within the stone mass. The whole structure occupied roughly 64 square feet of floor space. Substantial, yes, but Thomas had designed his cabin layout around it. The sleeping loft, accessible by a ladder, wrapped around the stone core's upper section. On the coldest nights, the stored heat radiating from those upper stones would keep the sleeping area comfortable with no fire burning at all. If you're fascinated by this engineering, hit that like button and subscribe. We're just getting to the incredible part. Comment below and tell us, have you ever seen a heating system like this? Samuel McCreary stopped by in early December, the day Thomas installed the final chimney cap. The temperature was 19 degrees. Thomas had a small fire burning, testing the draft. "Seems to pull all right," McCreary admitted, watching smoke rise steadily from the chimney. He stepped inside. The cabin was warm, surprisingly warm, given a modest fire. "That stone's been absorbing heat for 3 hours," Thomas explained. "Touch it." McCreary placed his palm on the sandstone 6 feet from the firebox. It was hot, not enough to burn, but distinctly, solidly hot. "Now here's what Wheeler doesn't understand," Thomas continued. "Sandstone has a specific heat capacity of 0.18 BTU per pound per degree. About 4,200 pounds of it. If I raise its average temperature by 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 75,600 BTUs stored in the mass. That heat will radiate for 12 to 16 hours, long after the fire's gone cold. McCreary nodded slowly. He didn't understand the numbers, but he understood warm stone. Wheeler says you'll burn twice the wood. Wheeler's wrong. I'll burn half. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside Thomas Brennan's cabin, the stone hummed with stored heat, waiting for winter to prove what the books had promised. That mass and geometry and careful attention to thermodynamics could outperform 3 generations of conventional wisdom. The test was coming. Everyone in the valley could feel it in the wind. The cold arrived ahead of schedule. On December 18th, a mass of Arctic air swept down from Alberta, dropping temperatures across the Bitterroot Valley to levels the old-timers claimed hadn't been seen since the winter of '78. By December 20th, the mercury at McCreary's store read 8 degrees at noon. Jacob Wheeler made a public prediction. Standing in the store, which had become the unofficial gathering place for men escaping their freezing cabins, Wheeler announced that Thomas Brennan would be begging for help before Christmas. That stone tower of his is pulling heat out of his cabin faster than any fire can replace it, Wheeler said to a crowd of nodding heads. Basic thermodynamics. Cold stone is a heat sink. He'll be burning 3 cords a week just to keep the edge off. Martin Kohler agreed. I stopped by his place yesterday. The boy's got confidence, I'll give him that. But confidence doesn't keep you alive at 10 below. What they didn't know, what Thomas hadn't told anyone, was that he'd barely lit his fire in 3 days. The stone mass, once brought to temperature, was holding heat so effectively that he'd been burning just 3 logs each evening, letting the fire die by midnight, and waking to a cabin that was still 68 degrees at dawn. His wood consumption, 12 logs daily. Wheeler was burning 40. But Thomas kept quiet. Let them assume what they wanted. The real test was still coming, and he knew it. The difference between 8 degrees and 20 below was the difference between theory and survival. On December 23rd, Reverend Pike visited. He was making rounds, checking on isolated homesteaders, ensuring no one was in danger. He found Thomas splitting wood in shirt sleeves while a pale winter sun struggled through cloud cover. Your brother's worried about you, Pike said. Daniel worries about everything. He says your heating system is experimental. Says you might be putting yourself at risk. Thomas set down his axe. Reverend, would you like to see something? Inside the cabin, Pike removed his heavy coat immediately. The warmth was undeniable, solid, even, radiating from the stone core that dominated the cabin's center. Thomas's thermometer, mounted on the north wall farthest from the fire, read 71 degrees. When did you last tend the fire? 7 hours ago. Small fire, burned for maybe 90 minutes. Pike walked around the stone structure, placing his hands on different sections. All of them were warm, not scalding, but distinctly, substantially warm. The heat was everywhere, as if the cabin itself had become a living thing that breathed warmth into every corner. The men at McCreary's say this is impossible. The men at McCreary's are burning 4 times the wood I am. Pike considered this. He was an educated man, seminary-trained, familiar with scientific principles. Thermal mass, he said finally, like the brick ovens in the old mission churches. Exactly like that. Only I've got more mass and better heat retention than any oven. And when it gets truly cold, when it drops to 20 below, Thomas met his eyes. Then we'll find out if I'm brilliant or dead. The Reverend left with a promise to check back after Christmas. He also left with doubt creeping into his certainty that the experienced builders were right. The warmth of that cabin had been undeniable. By December 28th, word had spread. Thomas Brennan's cabin was reportedly warmer than any structure in the valley, and he was burning less wood than homesteaders half his size. People began to stop by, some out of curiosity, others outright hostile. It's a trick, one man said. He's burning coal, or he's exaggerating his wood consumption. But Thomas kept meticulous records, dates, temperatures, fuel used. He knew the accusations would come, and he'd prepared evidence. Jacob Wheeler didn't visit. He sent his son instead, with a message. Father says you're lucky it's been a mild winter so far. Says the real cold hasn't come yet. The boy, perhaps 14, looked around the cabin with wide eyes before leaving. Wheeler was right about one thing. The real cold hadn't come yet, but it was coming. Thomas could feel it in the wind, see it in the way the snow crystals had changed from soft flakes to hard, brittle grains. The kind of cold that killed cattle and split trees. The kind of cold that separated functional designs from fatal ones. On December 31st, the temperature dropped to 14 degrees. By morning, it would be 0, and 3 days after that, it would test everything Thomas Brennan believed about heat, stone, and the difference between conventional wisdom and actual physics. January 9th, 1892. The temperature at dawn was 32 below 0. Thomas woke in darkness, the cabin silent except for the wind howling outside. He didn't need to check the thermometer on his wall to know something extraordinary had happened. He could feel it in the air, in the strange, brittle quality of the cold pressing against the log walls. When he struck a match and lit his lamp, the thermometer confirmed it. The mercury had retreated into the bulb, below the lowest marking. His cabin's interior temperature, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. No fire had burned for 8 hours. A mile west, in Jacob Wheeler's well-built cabin with its conventional exterior fireplace, the temperature was 28 degrees despite Wheeler having risen twice in the night to add wood. His water bucket had frozen solid. His breath fogged thick in the lamplight. In Martin Kohler's cabin, the situation was similar. 31 degrees, 3 blankets on the bed, and wood consumption that would empty his woodshed by February if this cold continued. Across the Bitterroot Valley, families huddled around fires that barely pushed back the cold, burning wood at rates that would leave them dangerously short before winter's end. The Arctic air mass had settled over Montana like a frozen blanket, and the old-timers were saying it might last for weeks. Thomas built a small fire, 6 logs, arranged for efficient combustion. Within 30 minutes, his cabin temperature climbed to 73 degrees. The stone core, which had cooled from its usual 140 to 150 degree surface temperature to around 90 degrees overnight, began absorbing heat again, banking it for the long day ahead. At McCreary's store, which didn't open until 9 due to the cold, men gathered with stories of frozen water, of fires that couldn't keep up, of wood consumption that was becoming genuinely frightening. "I burned 18 logs last night alone," one homesteader reported. 18. "And I still woke to frost on the inside of my windows." 22. Another said, "My wife and children slept in their coats." Jacob Wheeler arrived late, looking haggard. He'd burned through 43 logs in the past 24 hours. His woodshed, which should have lasted until March, was now half empty, and it was only January 9th. "Anyone seen Brennan?" someone asked. Wheeler's jaw tightened. "Probably frozen in that stone tomb of his." But at that moment, Thomas was walking toward the store, having left his cabin with just a light jacket and gloves. The fire he'd built at dawn had burned down to coals, and his cabin was still 70 degrees. He'd calculated he could let it go cold until evening and still maintain livable temperature. His wood consumption for the previous 24 hours, 19 logs. When he entered McCreary's store, conversation stopped. He looked warm, rested, unburdened by the desperate exhaustion that marked every other man present. "Brennan," McCreary said carefully, "how's your situation?" "Comfortable." "How much wood did you burn last night?" Thomas removed his gloves. 13 logs. 6 this morning. I'll probably burn another 6 tonight." The silence was profound. Wheeler's face went from red to white. "That's impossible," Wheeler said flatly. It was 32 below. "No cabin maintains heat on 13 logs at that temperature." "Mine did." "You're lying. Or your thermometer is wrong." "Or 64 degrees at dawn," Thomas said quietly. 73 degrees 30 minutes after lighting this morning's fire. Current temperature, as of 30 minutes ago when I left, 70 degrees and holding. If you're captivated by this story, smash that like button and subscribe, because you need to see what happens next. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced cold like this. Martin Kohler stood. He was a fair man, despite his earlier skepticism. "I'd like to see this. Would you permit a visit?" Thomas nodded. "Come this afternoon. Bring anyone who wants to verify." By 2 o'clock, 7 men stood in Thomas Brennan's cabin. The fire had been dead for 3 hours. The exterior temperature was 29 below. The cabin's interior, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Jacob Wheeler placed his hand on the stone core and jerked it back, still too hot to hold comfortably. He walked to the north wall, the farthest point from the thermal mass, and checked the temperature there, 66 degrees. A difference of just 2 degrees across the entire cabin. No cold corners, no frozen edges. Just solid, even, radiant warmth flowing from 4,200 pounds of sandstone that had been storing and releasing heat with ruthless efficiency. How long will it hold? Wheeler asked, his voice changed. Without any fire at all? In this cold, probably down to 50 degrees by midnight. But I'll light another small fire at sunset, bring it back to 75, and it'll hold above 60 until dawn. The math was undeniable. The evidence was physical, measurable, undismissible. At 32 below zero, the coldest temperature in 14 years, Thomas Brennan's cabin was 32 degrees warmer than Wheeler's. 40 degrees warmer than some of the less efficient homesteads. And he was burning less than half the wood. Wheeler stood silent for a long moment, his hand still on the warm stone. Then he did something Thomas hadn't expected. He extended his other hand. "I was wrong," Wheeler said simply. "Completely wrong. This is the most efficient heating system I've ever seen." Outside, the wind continued to howl, carrying cold that could kill an unprepared man in minutes. Inside, 7 frontier builders stood in warmth, staring at the stone structure that had just rewritten everything they thought they knew about survival in the Montana winter. The real test had come, and Thomas Brennan's silly idea had passed with the quiet authority of physics itself. The cold snap lasted 11 days. During that time, Thomas Brennan's cabin became something of a phenomenon in the Bitterroot Valley. Word spread beyond the immediate community. Homesteaders from 20 miles away made the journey to see the stone heating system that was defying the brutal cold with half the wood consumption of conventional cabins. Thomas kept meticulous records, knowing that anecdotal evidence wouldn't be enough. Each day, he logged 3 measurements: exterior temperature at dawn, interior temperature at dawn, and total wood consumption over the previous 24 hours. By January 19th, when the cold finally broke, he had 11 days of data that told an irrefutable story. Average exterior temperature during the cold snap, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Average interior temperature in Thomas's cabin at dawn, after 8 to 10 hours with no fire, 63 degrees. Average wood consumption, 21 logs per day, or roughly 1/3 of a cord per week. Jacob Wheeler, who had swallowed his pride and visited the cabin 3 more times during the cold spell, had his own numbers. Average dawn temperature of 34 degrees, wood consumption of 47 logs daily, nearly 1.5 cords weekly. The difference wasn't marginal. It was transformative. The stone mass doesn't just store heat, Thomas explained to a group of visitors on January 15th. It radiates it evenly in all directions. A conventional fireplace pushes hot air up and out, creating convection currents. You get 1 hot wall and 3 cold ones. But radiant heat from thermal mass? It fills the entire space uniformly. He demonstrated by placing thermometers in 8 different locations throughout his cabin: north wall, south wall, east and west corners, near the floor, at head height, in the sleeping loft. After the morning fire had burned down and the stone had been radiating for 2 hours, the temperature variance across all 8 locations was less than 4 degrees. In Wheeler's cabin, the variance was 23 degrees, scalding near the fireplace, barely above freezing in the far corners. Martin Kohler, a German builder, brought his son to measure the stone's surface temperature at various distances from the firebox. 6 inches from the firebox, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. 18 inches out, 145 degrees. 3 feet out, 118 degrees. At the stone's outer edge, 6 feet from the firebox center, 95 degrees. "It's a gradient," Kohler said with something like wonder. "The entire mass is a heat battery, just like you said." By late January, 3 homesteaders had begun modifying their cabins. It wasn't possible to retrofit the full central core design that required building from foundation up, but they could add thermal mass to their existing fireplaces. Kohler helped them install sandstone backs and sides, extending the masonry from the typical 4 inches to 12 inches in depth. The results, while not as dramatic as Thomas's system, were significant. A 15 to 20% reduction in wood consumption and noticeably more even heat distribution. Jacob Wheeler took a different approach. He began planning a new cabin for his eldest son, who was preparing to marry in the spring. The design incorporated everything Thomas had demonstrated: central thermal core, extended flue path for 1,000+ pounds of river sandstone, deliberate geometry for optimal heat storage and radiation. "I'm 62 years old," Wheeler told Thomas when he came to ask for the specifications. "Built my first cabin when I was 19. Thought I knew everything there was to know about keeping warm in Montana. Turns out I've been doing it the hard way for 43 years. There was no bitterness in his voice, just the plain acknowledgement of fact. Thomas shared his calculations, his material specifications, even the sources for the Russian masonry heater papers that had inspired the design. By the end of February, 17 cabins within 50 miles had incorporated some version of Thomas's thermal mass principles. Some built full central cores. Others added mass to existing fireplaces. A few constructed hybrid systems, combining conventional placement with increased stone mass and extended flue paths. The wood savings alone would allow these families to redirect labor. Less time cutting and hauling fuel meant more time for other essential work. But the real value was comfort and safety. In a climate where winter temperatures could kill, a heating system that maintained livable warmth through the night without constant tending was the difference between exhausting survival and sustainable habitation. Samuel McCreary, ever the businessman, began stocking sandstone specifically for thermal mass construction. He ordered copies of the Russian masonry heater papers Thomas had used, making them available to anyone interested. By March, he'd sold enough stone for 8 complete thermal core systems. "You've changed how this valley builds," McCreary told Thomas. That's not a small thing. But perhaps the most significant adoption came from an unexpected source. The Salish people who lived in the valley had been watching the experiment with interest. Several of their traditional winter lodges already incorporated thermal mass principles through different methods. Heated stones placed in strategic locations, earth-sheltered construction, careful attention to heat retention. A Salish elder named Many Horses visited Thomas in early March, bringing his grandson as translator. "Your stone fire is similar to our old ways," Many Horses said through his grandson. "The young ones have forgotten, but the old lodges knew about holding heat in mass. You have remembered something important." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Thomas learned that the principles he discovered in Russian engineering papers had parallels in indigenous practices that predated European settlement by centuries. Different implementations, same physics. Many Horses invited Thomas to visit their winter camp to see how they used thermal mass in their own structures. Thomas went and came back with new ideas about earth sheltering and thermal envelope design that would influence his next building project. The knowledge was flowing in multiple directions now, not just from Thomas outward, but from traditional practices into modern application, from one culture's engineering to another's wisdom. If this story of innovation and knowledge sharing resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment below what traditional building wisdom exists in your region that modern construction has forgotten. By spring thaw, Thomas Brennan's silly idea had proven itself beyond any doubt. The data was clear. The comfort was undeniable. The wood savings were substantial and verifiable. What had begun as one young man's experiment had become a movement toward more efficient, more sustainable frontier construction. And it had all started because someone was willing to trust physics over convention, to calculate rather than assume, to build something different despite the mockery of men who claimed to know better. The stone core in Thomas's cabin would continue radiating heat for another 47 winters. The cabin still stands today, incorporated into a modern ranch house. The thermal mass system still functions, a testament to the enduring truth that good engineering, properly executed, outlasts the skepticism that greets it. There's a particular kind of arrogance that comes from confusing experience with understanding. Jacob Wheeler had built 17 cabins before Thomas Brennan built his first. Wheeler knew how to select timber, how to chink logs, how to site a fireplace for proper draft. He knew these things the way a man knows the shape of his own hands, intimately, unquestioningly. But knowledge of how is not the same as knowledge of why. Wheeler had never asked why fireplaces were built on exterior walls. He'd never calculated the thermal efficiency of his designs or questioned whether the heating methods passed down through generations were actually optimal. He'd simply replicated what worked well enough, what kept people alive through Montana winters. Thomas Brennan, with no building experience at all, had started from a different place. He'd asked why. Why does heat dissipate? Why does stone hold warmth longer than wood? Why does air movement matter? He'd read about thermodynamics, studied specific heat capacity, calculated thermal mass retention rates. The difference in their approaches was the difference between craft and engineering. Both are valuable, but when craft becomes dogma, when this is how it's done becomes this is the only way it can be done, innovation dies. The story of Thomas's thermal mass heating system is not primarily about heating. It's about the danger of dismissing ideas simply because they contradict established practice. It's about the difference between tradition and traditionalism, between preserving what works and refusing to examine whether it could work better. The builders who mocked Thomas weren't fools. They were experienced men who'd survived decades of brutal winters using methods that functioned adequately. Their skepticism was, in many ways, reasonable. Most unconventional ideas fail. Most young men with revolutionary designs learn expensive lessons about why the old ways persisted. But not all of them. And the cost of automatically dismissing innovation is that sometimes, not often, but sometimes, you reject something genuinely better. By 1895, variations of Thomas's thermal mass design had spread across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. A modified version appeared in the Alberta territories. Mining camps in the Rockies incorporated the principles into their bunkhouse construction. The wood savings alone represented thousands of cords annually. Less labor, less deforestation, less risk of running short during extended cold spells. The U.S. Geological Survey, conducting a study on frontier resource efficiency, noted the Bitterroot Valley thermal mass cabins in their 1897 report. The data Thomas had collected became part of the technical literature on frontier construction, cited in government publications about homesteading in extreme climates. But perhaps the most important legacy wasn't the specific design. It was the shift in thinking it represented. After Thomas's success, frontier builders became more willing to experiment, to test, to question whether the inherited methods were truly optimal or simply familiar. Martin Kohler's son began incorporating calculated ventilation systems into cabin designs, reducing moisture problems and improving air quality. Another builder experimented with double-wall construction for better insulation. A third developed an improved root cellar design based on thermal mass principles applied to food storage. The culture of building changed. Not completely. Tradition still held enormous influence, and rightly so, as most traditional practices embodied accumulated wisdom. But the automatic dismissal of new ideas became less reflexive. The question shifted from, why change what works, to could this work better? Thomas himself built 3 more thermal mass cabins, each an improvement on the last. He never became a professional builder. He remained primarily a rancher, but his influence on frontier architecture far exceeded his direct construction output. In 1903, he published a small technical manual, Principles of Thermal Mass Heating for Frontier Construction, which sold modest numbers but influenced a generation of Western builders. The manual was practical, filled with calculations, material specifications, and honest assessments of both advantages and limitations. He died in 1934, at age 66, having lived his entire adult life in the cabin he'd built at 23. The stone core he'd installed in 1891 was still radiating heat on the night he passed, still doing exactly what the physics said it would do, still proving that careful attention to natural law outperforms casual reliance on convention. The broader lesson extends beyond heating systems. beyond frontier construction, beyond even the specific historical moment. It's a lesson about intellectual humility, about recognizing that expertise in how things have been done doesn't automatically translate to expertise in how things could be done. Traditional knowledge deserves respect. The people who live close to survival's edge, who passed down practices through generations, who encoded solutions to recurrent problems into cultural practice, they weren't fools. Their methods worked, or they wouldn't have survived. But worked well enough to survive is not the same as cannot be improved. And the automatic rejection of innovation because it contradicts tradition reveals not the foolishness of the innovator, but the intellectual rigidity of the skeptic. Thomas Brennan's stone heating core proved that a 23-year-old with no construction experience could, through careful study and application of fundamental principles, outperform experienced builders who'd spent decades perfecting conventional methods. Not because he was smarter, but because he asked different questions. The men who laughed at his silly idea weren't bad men. They were normal men, exhibiting the normal human tendency to trust the familiar and doubt the novel. But normality is not the same as correctness. And the cost of their skepticism, had Thomas been less determined, would have been decades of unnecessary fuel consumption, decades of less comfortable winters, decades of frontier families working harder than necessary because the better method had been dismissed as impossible. If this story has taught you something about the value of questioning assumptions and respecting both traditional wisdom and innovative thinking, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Drop a comment below telling us, what impossible idea have you seen proven right? What conventional wisdom in your field deserves to be challenged? We bring you stories like this every week. Historical accounts of engineering wisdom, frontier innovation, and the timeless lessons they teach us about problem solving and intellectual humility. Subscribe now and join thousands of others who appreciate when the silly ideas turn out to be brilliant. The cabin still stands in the Bitterroot Valley, a testament to the enduring truth that physics doesn't care about consensus. The stone core still radiates warmth, still proves, 137 years later, that sometimes the young fool with the calculations is wiser than the experienced expert with the assumptions. And every winter, when the temperature drops and the wind howls down from Canada, that stone remembers what Thomas Brennan knew in 1891. That mass stores heat, that geometry matters, that careful attention to natural law will always, eventually, outperform careless reliance on tradition. The rancher's son was right. The experienced builders were wrong. And the 32-degree difference between his cabin and theirs was not a miracle. It was simply physics, properly understood and honestly applied.